Hello, everybody. This is John Arnold of J. Arnold and Associates, and I am back with another Watch This Space podcast with my trusty partner, Chris Fine of Integrative Technologies. Chris, hi.
Hi, how are you doing? Hello, everybody.
Good.
Good to be back.
Yeah, it sure is. And we say that literally, right? Because as we're recording in the kind of getting into the later part of October, you and I have both been on the road a fair bit, traveling to different events, different circles, but some common themes that we can explore. And I think this is another good example of that. So first, I do want to just do a shout out to those who have been listening to our recent podcasts. We know you enjoy them. And as you can see, we are fine-tuning our messaging and positioning as we go. So we've adopted this new moniker called Watch This Space, and I think you'll see a few more things coming up in the near term that will give our efforts here, Chris and I, a little bit more of a refined look and feel. So we're getting to the point, I think, Chris, where the podcasts are kind of on a good cycle, and I think we're going to do some branding, huh?
I think so. I think you need to play some incidental music too.
Ooh, good hint. Good hint. Yes, the piano is not in ear reach right now, but that is a good incentive to come up with a little theme song. So yes,
yeah,
noted.
The intro.
Noted. All right. So let's get into what's been happening. Boy, oh boy, there's probably 5 topics we could touch on right now, but let's start out with you because you've been to some interesting shows. And for those who don't follow Chris as much as they might follow me, we work very much in adjacent circles. And I'd say, Chris, I'll just mention the names, 2 events, CEDIA and CoREnet, and you can kind of take the lead from here and just talk a little bit about this kind of focus area that brings you to these events and how it ties into these trends we look at in collaboration technologies.
Well, thanks, John. Yes, it was 2 shows. One was back in September, was the CEDIA, which is the high-end residential technology show. So it's mostly for the professional integrators and designers and vendors to same, which supply technology for high-end residences and hotels, apartments, houses, etc. So when you hear about these super houses with all the inherent technology wired in, that these are the people who do that. And CoREnet is for professional corporate real estate people. And where the linkage is a theme that you and I have explored and I really believe in, which is the merging of experiential technology into all kinds of space. I think what you're finding is more and more people have grown up around technology like the iPhone and video games and all the other types of things that are really experiential. They're not just tools. And so we see that mentality of wanting to have more of an experience going into more and more areas of technology, including collaboration and communications, John, which is your area. But what I found, it's just starting out with CEDIA, was that this technology is starting to trickle down from the very, very high end into, for example, apartment buildings and housing developments, which are not super ultra luxury, but the technology at some level comes built in as part of the purchase price when it's new property. And it's very, very appealing to people. And so the kind of technology that's built in is, for example, large TVs connected directly to the cable and DVR capability. There are various mechanisms that will bring the frames in and out of cabinets and walls and things like that. There's more and more speakers that are embedded in the rooms. There's a lot of Alexa and voice recognition that we've talked about, plus higher end networking to undergird the whole thing as a platform. And so you also see vendors like Sonos who are trying to own the audio in the whole house or the whole residence. And what's really interesting is when you start to talk to the leading edge of the folks who do this for a living, you start to understand that they're getting pulled into new types of office space, particularly co-working space. Not necessarily to say WeWork, but let's just say the WeWorks of the world, of which there are many, and also next generation corporate space. And they're putting the same type of stuff in there. Then when you fast forward to CoREnet, you see a lot of corporate real estate folks thinking all the time about employee experience, because they're realizing that is a key element of the outfitting of any space, that they're not just sort of industrial age warehouses for people anymore, or factories for people. They're more experience, and the experience is related to how much productivity and collaboration and enjoyment, and thus retention and all the other factors that occupants of the space can get. And it also helps the managers manage the space better. So it's just interesting to see all this merge. And I know there's a lot to say, but I really think it's a trend. I don't know if you've seen anything similar on your side.
Well, yeah, this is really fascinating stuff, and it doesn't play out so much with the vendors I typically see, although we've talked before about Plantronics, before the merger, having this thing called habitat soundscaping. And that's a real outlier kind of offering, but it's exactly in line with this idea of the technology, the technology we use every day. We see it, we touch it, it's in our hands, it's on our earbuds, it's tangible. Habitat soundscaping, as you know, I think is all about, it's technology you don't see or touch, but it's there. And this is all about kind of adapting the environment to be conducive to productivity in the workplace. So it's kind of like a bit of a Wizard of Oz thing, where the ambient scenarios, change, adapt to the activity level that's going on in the space to optimize productivity, right? So if there's a lot of noise from cubes nearby, it can kind of moderate some of that, so it's a little more manageable, less distracting, that kind of thing. And this is just an example, I think, of where some of these technologies go. And as you say, it's part of that experience of, just like we move out of cubes and work on long tables or in lounges, that's a different experience, but it's these tools that really, I think, are what create the connectivity between people to people and people with ideas, to share them and bring them into, team-based environments. And so that's where these worlds, I find, get really, really, intertwined in a nice way. But the way what you're talking here, Chris, is, these players, the real estate developers and people who have input in designs of space, they're, I think, becoming more closer to the center of how IT and corporate enterprise environments have to think about how do we make the best space for the needs of our workers.
I agree, John, and I also think there's a lot of economics around this, because if you look at utilization of space and you look at the typical utilization rate or occupancy rate day to day for office space, very often it's not that high per square foot. So you have big empty areas because of kind of old-fashioned design, and then you have too crowded areas, and you don't historically have a lot of great technology to measure even how well all of this is used. But when you start to think more about design and you start thinking more about experience, you can also help optimize the size of the place. If you know more about work habits and you understand what people are doing and when they work at home versus on the road versus in the office, you can, for lack of a better word, multitask the space better. And I'll give you an example of something specific that you said about technologies being used for multiple things and sort of dynamic changes in the environment, like soundscaping, like habitat. So one very interesting area is the whole area of screens and signage. And one of the things that you're seeing that's starting to blur between the residence and the office is that you have screens in various places that are not just doing one thing. So at CEDIA, Samsung, for example, was showing a whole range of really cool looking screens called the frame. And they came in all different sizes, and they could really be purposed to do anything. Like they could be signage, they could be art, and there was even a service you could sign up to subscribe to art, and the picture would change based on tastes and all of this when it's not being used as a TV. And lo and behold, I went into one of the leading edge spaces that I know, which is the Aruba headquarters in Santa Clara. And what's on the wall? The Samsung frames. And what they're being used for when they're not being used for collaboration or video conferencing or signage is to have scenes of nature that blend in with the habitat soundscaping. Because the habitat soundscaping is actually built on a lot of electronic synthesis and around natural sounds. And the ability to break up conversations and provide a certain amount of privacy is based on a property of water as it flows over stones and, in a brook. And so they took that, and it doesn't really sound like you're standing by a brook, but it has that certain feel to it. And so the natural scenes on the walls tend to be woods or a brook or whatever. And so it's all synchronized together in the environment. But if you need that screen to do something else, it can do it. And they have these frames the size of picture frames all the way up to really big screens. And the electronics is separate from the screen, so you don't have to make a gigantic hole in the wall to put this thing up. It's just a couple of fiber optic cables that do all the communicating. So it's that additional element of design that it kind of doesn't matter what environment you're putting in. It always looks like good design. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the cynic in me thinks about Brave New World, where you're making the environment as pleasing and stress-free as possible to keep everybody kind of pacified and under control. But the more practical side of this is, yes, everyone's multitasking, they're frantic, they can't focus. So this is a way to kind of offset that and calm things down. I suppose if you are, a buyer and an IT decision maker or influencer, I think you could see this as being a very, progressive direction for the technology. And the flip side, of course, is you have to be careful how it plays out, because when you bring this into the environment, there's also a danger, I think, that it can be seen as a bit of a, almost like an overly contrived or overly, engineered environment where, they're basically trying to control every aspect of our space to make us conform to a certain, standard of work and interaction. So I think there's an element there that, we can't just, or shouldn't, I should say, maybe just blindly take this technology at face value and recognize, we're still talking about humans in the work environment. And that's a tricky balance to strike that we're all, I think, cognizant of. But, I'm just throwing a little caution out there to say we got to think about also how it comes across to people. If you're coming at it too heavy-handedly, it might not be taken the right way.
Well, that's a good point. And so it's everything that you say in terms of privacy and non-control and all of that, but it's also just a matter of style and design. I mean, you don't want to do the equivalent of 1970s orange office walls, which are instantly obsolete once things change the slightest bit, But you also don't want to look like the completely bland decade that followed that, or 2 decades with, just everything gray and beige and cubicles. I think one way you get around all of this is you design spaces with a lot of different types of spaces in them, nooks and crannies and different types of places where you can work, because this encourages people to actually interact more and gives them different places to hang out in that may be conducive to their thinking or activity at any given moment. So you free them more from just being in a cubicle or at a desk. And as far as the technology goes, I think it is a real art of design and engineering not to make it intrusive, and not to make it compromise privacy or look like the screens in an episode of The Twilight Zone or 1984. And when you were talking, I thought about that scene in 1984 when they finally get caught, Winston, and they're in there apartment that they think doesn't have any technology in it, and then the picture drops off the wall and there's a screen behind it.
Yeah. Don't be fooled by the antique dealer downstairs. Yeah.
We don't want that, right? The idea, though, is that it's possible to make a lot of improvements, whether in office or residence, to just make the design more integrated with the environment. You know? So it kind of gets like the difference between, a big noisy air conditioner in the window versus central air, and other amenities like that. In residence, there's a long way to go with that. And in the office, you just kind of want it to be seamless. You don't want to have it to be an impediment to perform any activity that requires technological involvement.
Yeah. And I think that plays well into the broader kind of, digital transformation that all businesses are going through. And, when you start to think digital design and digital applications, you can reinvent a lot of things from the ground up. And, that office environment is pretty ripe for that. And I can't help but think, it seems these days, no matter what city you go to, there's office towers going up, right? There's a lot of construction activity because the real estate's so valuable now. And you can't help but think, Chris, that anything that's being built now as a new office environment or workspace has got to have this built kind of in the DNA from the bottom up, right? It's got to be.
Well, yeah, and that's another thing that you and I have talked about is, who owns the technology? It's a really interesting question, the evolution of IT, because to your point, in these new buildings, there's more and more common amenity areas and, shared facilities and flexible space and all this other modern fluid type of design. And you need more and more capability to manage borderless public and private space, if I could call it that, right? Because the whole idea of a border has really started to dissolve. And so whether it's working at home or whether it's just different companies in the same space or whether it's, flexible space as a service or common areas of the building, it's a really new area, very different from the past. And it really starts to play when you start to think about things like wireless in a building. How is 5G going to play out versus Wi-Fi? And how do you provide a fabric of services to everybody in the building, whether it's a residence or whether it's an office or a hotel or a college or wherever it is, that provides the right level of services and who manages that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think as 5G starts to become real, obviously the Sprints and Verizons of the world will want to be at the front of the line for this stuff when you start getting into these office buildings and campus environments, et cetera, where, with that kind of throughput, the level of services that can be provided, could turn out to be a really good, maybe second act for some of these carriers who are needing new revenue streams and revenues, period, just to offset the costs of 5G infrastructure. This area of really like blanket coverage for a building and what will that entail? And then partitioning services that are private for, each tenant in the building. I think there could be some really interesting, as you said, common services that could be extended to every touch point inside that environment. Pretty fascinating stuff,
Yeah, but suppose you're the head of corporate real estate and, in the past, you didn't really have to manage a lot of technology. You managed, in fact, you probably even outsourced or contracted the management of things like building systems. So your technology could be largely sort of at the database and spreadsheet and a few applications and some CAD drawings type of stuff. And now, you're kind of the central point in managing a whole bunch of new technologies. And, just on that wireless point, if you think about, there's actually a whole other side to the story with 5G because of all the breakthroughs that are happening with Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi 6 and services like Passpoint, where you can use your SIM card in your phone to validate into the Wi-Fi network without having to put in a username password. So there's a lot of change in the wind. Now, I think there's a lot of opportunity, but a lot of challenge as well. And things are really transforming in terms of the roles of different groups who are involved with this.
Yeah, and just as an aside to that, we've been, the main thing I've been thinking of here has been the workplace environment, which is still largely a 9 to 5 scenario. But as these smart buildings go up, forget about the HVAC and all of the, operational stuff that keeps the lights on and the heat going, et cetera. But for the managing the utilization of the space, et cetera, this is obviously going to shift into an IoT scenario.
Oh, for sure. And if you look at, again, CoREnet Real Estate Conference, right? What are a lot of the booths? Different types of sensors and different types of systems to measure utilization of space and to manage space. There's a whole category of software called IWMS, which is space management, basically. Who sits where the floor plans reside. And there's a new generation of companies getting into that, which had been sort of a legacy client server world of, probably 15, 20 years vintage. And these are much more modern architecture, software, graphic, mobile clients, drag and drop, things like that. And that opens up a lot of opportunity as well, because, for example, if you have open space to begin with, but certain spaces are assigned, and you can drag and drop somebody from one place to another on a map, and it's basically a zero cost move because anything associated with them just automatically gets transferred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anything related to real estate, the numbers in real estate are so large that if you can just, have an impact of 1% or 2% on a real estate budget, it's enough to pay for a lot of technology.
For sure. Yeah. And then you push out to things like first responders. This ties into like 911 services when you have a whole building, wired up for sensors. Think about, if for a disaster, people, it can be intelligence about what's the best way to leave the building, where not to go, locking doors, turning light, all that kind of stuff that could really save lives. But I speak, then it ties into, how your insurance rates are set, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of touch points here for sure. So, Chris, this is a rich topic, and I want to cut it off here because I think we're keeping this at a really nice high level, and I get stuff I want to touch on for my travels, but I want to save that for another time because I think this wraps up a nice topic here today.
Well, John, I didn't mean to cut out your allocation of the time. I just get enthusiastic about this because we're kind of if we're talking about watch this space, we're really, the service we might provide to our listeners is try to identify some trends.
Yeah.
And you and I both see this as a big trend, this merging together of all these different currents that used to be very separated.
For sure. And we're watching. We are watching this space. So I think this makes for a nice nice wrap up because I like where this is going, and I think and hope our listeners will enjoy what we've been covering here today. Okay, so let's make this a wrap, and then we'll come back with another podcast pretty soon, and we'll just keep exploring because there's so much. It never ends. All right, so big thank you, Chris.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. And we will see you next time.
All right, cool. Over and out for now, so watch this space. Chris Fine and myself, John Arnold, signing off, and we'll catch you on the next podcast.